Tonight, this special lecture is presented in conjunction with the Environmental Sustainability Research Center, Brock University, and this wonderful banner. And I want to thank Luane Hathaway of the Research Center for her support in organizing the events this evening, and also Brian Plummer, the chair of the Research Center and of the Sustainability Science and Society program at the ESRC, which we launched this evening. Thank you, Brian. And Brian is going to be thanking our speaker this evening, so he'll be talking at the close of the hot talk. We're very pleased to have Dr. Robert Sandford with us this evening. Bob was a guest at the second Emergent Emergencies residency at the Banff Center in May 2013, where he met all the artists in the show. The exhibition came about through an artist research group called Emergent Emergencies and Possible Worlds, which had two residency structures that generated the exhibition that we're presenting. By way of introduction, I want to tell you that Dr. Sandford is the EPCOR Chair of the Canadian Partnership Initiative in support of the United Nations Water for Life Decade. This national partnership initiative aims to inform the public on water issues and translate scientific research outcomes into language decision makers can use to craft timely and meaningful public policy. Bob also sits on the advisory committee for the prestigious Rosenberg International Forum on Water Policy. In this capacity, Bob works to bring broad international example to bear on Canadian water issues. He told me to keep the intro short, so I'm going to skip the next paragraph, and I'll be happy to inform you about a wonderful list of credentials. Bob has also published a number of high-profile books on water, including Cold Matters, The State and Fate of Canada's Snow and Ice, which was published in late 2012. Bob's sixth book on water, Saving Lake Winnipeg, was published by Rocky Mountain Books in the fall of 2013. And the latest R&B publication, Flood Forecast, was co-authored with Carrie Creek in May 2014. So look for those on Amazon or at your local bookstore. And so please help me welcome Dr. Robert Sandford.
Well, first, I'd like to thank you for your kind introduction and also for your wonderful hospitality here in St. Catharines. I particularly want to thank Stuart Reed and Danny Custodio for all of their arrangements, and Danny's at the back there. And I have to say that it's an honor to be here, particularly in the context of this remarkable exhibition, but also in the context of the truly remarkable effort being made here at Brock to harness multidisciplinary and multi-generational energy and vision in support of our common future. While it wasn't said in the previous presentation, I think the term sustainability has been very badly abused. And as the provost said, the transition to meaningful sustainability is one of humanity's greatest challenges. And I also should say that I come to you tonight by a very circuitous route. I'm neither an artist nor a social scientist, and I'm not expert in matters related to the human condition, but I do work in an area that does have huge significance in terms of human well-being. I work in water, and while my work has principally been focused, as Stuart said, on public policy related to water availability, ground and surface water quality, and particularly floods and droughts, I'm never very far in my life from the otherworldly qualities of this most remarkable of substances. The water tends to repel organic compounds. It's strangely attracted to most inorganic substances, including itself. Water likes to be around other water. Its molecules, in fact, cling to one another more tenaciously than do many metals. And you can observe water's remarkable qualities of self-adhesion if you sit by a river. Water sticks together. Water draws water with it. Sit on a riverbank long enough and you might observe that water likes to sing. The faster it moves, the louder it sings. Still water barely whispers, and of course falling water absolutely roars. And there's also a reason we feel different when we're in the presence of large volumes of water. water reacts to almost everything, and almost everything reacts to water. The feeling you get standing on the edge of a river or a lake or beneath a thundering waterfall may be aesthetic, but there's something physical to it as well. Your body is aligning itself with the molecular attraction of the water, and the water is aligning itself to you. And the effect can even be more pronounced when you stand by the sea, ankle deep in surf. The water in our inner cellular seas yearns for the salty water without. The water within feels the tug of the tide. So in this sense, we know water, but water also knows us. The goal of the work in which I'm engaged is to build a better bridge between science and public policy on matters related to water and water-related climate issues. And it's under the auspices of this work I was invited by Patrick Mann to speak to an international group of artists at the Banff Centre on the state and fate of water in Canada. And it was really interesting because many of these artists have works in this current exhibition, and I was thrilled to be part of this process. And I was really interested in this opportunity because I've always believed that art is an important medium for sharing understanding of what's important about our relationship to one another and humanity's relationship to the rest of the world. Art, in my estimation, is a form of perceptual leadership. Meaningful art allows us to see clearly into the depths of reality and return again to the surface of our everyday lives with new insights and hope for the future. I've also noticed working as a scientist that people tend to trust art, not just because it speaks on so many levels to so many matters that are important to us, but because artists make ritual and actual sacrifices to be worthy of their objectivity. Artists speak sincerely from the heart. And because I was speaking to artists, I made sure that I spoke as clearly and honestly as I could also. And as a foundation for discussing what hope is up against in our time, I'd like to tell you part of what I told them and what I have learned since. Now, many of you will have undoubtedly observed that our weather appears to be all over the place. Weather is largely wind and water, and patterns are clearly changing. Rainstorms, ice storms, and snowstorms are paralyzing our transportation and electrical distribution systems. Both high and low temperature records are being broken everywhere. Cold snaps are persisting. Snow is falling in places and in volumes seldom witnessed before. Flooding's occurring widely. So one must ask, what can science tell us about all of this that we're not getting from newspapers, from television, or from Hollywood disaster movies? Well, what is happening is that changes in the composition of the Earth's atmosphere are not causing consistent warming of the atmosphere as we expected. That heat is being absorbed instead by water in both its solid and liquid forms. The heat is causing ice to melt and liquid water to evaporate, which is resulting in changes in the behavior of the global hydrologic cycle. So please allow me to introduce some of the connected hydroclimatic effects that researchers are identifying as threats to the stability of our weather systems. One of the most remarkable and significant recent advancements in hydrometeorology is the realization of the global importance of the refrigerating influence of polar sea ice. Polar ice is now seen as a thermostat that governs major weather patterns globally. And it's now feared that the decrease in the extent and thickness of sea ice could be the parameter that's feeding all of the increases that are causing concern over climate change. The loss of Arctic sea ice and the reduction of the extent and duration of snow cover in the northern hemisphere are reducing the temperature difference between the pole and the tropics. And it's this gradient in temperature between the polar region and the warmer air to the south that largely defines the behavior of the jet stream. And of course, much has been made lately in the media, especially here, of the role of the polar vortex. Now, there are actually two elliptical or circular polar vortices, one over the Arctic and one over the Antarctic in their respective winters. And the latter one's very stable because the South Pole is over land. In the Arctic, however, the vortex is a lot more variable. It's influenced from below by the changing Arctic sea ice cover and from above by stratospheric warming events. And this past winter, both factors served to weaken the vortex. And a weak vortex is much more susceptible to disturbance at its periphery by the polar jet stream. So instead of one consolidated vortex over the Arctic, there developed four lobes with cold circulations carried south in the troughs of the jet stream. And one of those lobes descended and lingered over Central and North America, and Eastern North America, making last winter, as many of you know, one of the most miserable in southern Ontario and certainly in Manitoba. So you'll clearly understand if I tell you that observations of the jet stream have revealed that warmer atmospheric temperatures do not automatically translate into warmer weather. And as we saw last winter, in a uniformly warmer and therefore more turbulent atmosphere, both warm and cold fronts end up and persist in places at the mid-latitudes in which they were not common in the past. And what we're also seeing is that changes in atmospheric circulation patterns are pushing major subtropical storm tracks toward the poles, often causing flooding of magnitudes that we're poorly equipped to manage. So we might derive from this that it appears that the Arctic is much more of a bellwether of climate change and climate disruption than we thought. The Arctic is warming 3 to 6 times faster than the rest of the planet in all seasons. And while we may not have perceived it as such, what's happening hydrologically in much of the rest of Canada mirrors what's happening in the Arctic. With rapid warming of the Arctic, we're beginning to understand just how much of the water we have in Canada is left over from the last ice age. What we're seeing is that the warming is causing the post-glacial hydrologic wealth of Canada to change form. And in the Arctic, sea ice is melting, permafrost is thawing, and snow cover is diminishing in both extent and duration. Warming is also occurring in Canada's western mountains where I live, and I should point out that recent research indicates that we lost some 300 glaciers between 1920 and 2005 in the Canadian Rockies alone. That water, however, is not disappearing. Water just doesn't do that. What we're seeing is that warmer temperatures are causing changes in the rate and manner in which water moves through the global hydrologic cycle. And what is also happening is that the liquid water is moving to a different place in the hydrosphere where it may not be available for us to use when we want it, as in the case of severe drought, and where under certain circumstances the warming atmosphere's capacity to carry more water can cause a lot more damage through flooding. And the algorithm upon which this assertion rests is one of the most fundamental principles of atmospheric physics. Warmer air holds more water, and the amount of water the atmosphere can hold increases by about 7% per degree Celsius, or about 4% per degree Fahrenheit. And in terms of water and weather, I have to tell you, this is a game changer. What we see is that we're witnessing things that we weren't able to see before or haven't seen at all before. And these include phenomena such as atmospheric rivers. Atmospheric rivers have likely existed for an eternity, but only now, because of satellite remote sensing capacity, do we know of their existence and are getting a better understanding of their dynamics. These corridors of intense winds and moist air can be 400 to 500 kilometers across and thousands of kilometers long. And you can see in the left-hand top map, that's what the Pineapple Express on the West Coast looks like. A hurricane trough coming across the Pacific, filled with atmospheric vapor, and collides with the West Coast, causing flooding, but also bringing water to places like California. What's really interesting about atmospheric rivers is we've learned that they can carry the equivalent of 10 times the average daily discharge of the St. Lawrence River. And what's new about our knowledge about them is that we have been confronted recently by a very striking realization. We have discovered that atmospheric rivers derive their energy from the temperature gradient between the poles and the tropics. And their intensity also derives from the Clausius-Clapeyron relation, in that the warmer the air, the more water atmospheric rivers can carry. Atmospheric rivers produce the flooding of the magnitude that we saw in Australia and Pakistan in 2010. And may have influenced flooding in Manitoba and Saskatchewan and North Dakota in 2011, in British Columbia, in Alberta in 2013, and many places in Canada this year, including this region during this past summer. So what might we learn from what's happening? What are we seeing that tells us that the hydrologic game is changing, and how should we respond to this? Well, fortunately, we're beginning to see how the main rules are changing. We know, first of all, that hydrological conditions on this planet have always been changing. We know that. We have been fortunate to have had a century or so of relative hydroclimatic stability in our time. That era, however, is over. The long-term hydrologic stability of the climate we experienced in the past will not return during the lifetime of anyone in this room. This game change means that simply managing water in ways that are useful to us will no longer be enough. We now have to be alert to changes in the larger global hydrologic cycle, and where possible, try to manage and adapt to them. And this is a very new, very large concept, and it's going to take time to get our heads around it. Predicted rises in temperature of between 2 and 6 degrees Celsius would result in further amplification of the hydrologic cycle by 15 to 40%. So what you see from this is that this game change is not going to go away. So, what does this mean to us now? Well, it means that we're going to have to pay attention to things that we're not attending to now. This is known as the Keeling curve. It tracks the upward winter and summer rise in global carbon dioxide concentrations. And we have to know what is behind the Keeling curve so we can get ahead of it. The reason for that is the new normal, I regret, is that there is no new normal. Unless we want our future to continue to be a moving target, sooner or later we're going to have to confront the fact that we're rapidly changing the character of the surface of our planet, and at the same time altering the composition of our planet's atmosphere. And I have to be honest with you, that this is not a subject that many want to talk about in meaningful terms where I live in Alberta. What has become clear also is that it isn't just emission cuts that we need to achieve to restore climatic stability. Curbing greenhouse gases is not going to be enough. We can no longer ignore the local value of natural ecosystem processes. In order to gain even partial reign over the hydrologic cycle, we have to enlist all the help that nature can provide us. And we gain that help by protecting and restoring critical aquatic ecosystem function by reversing land and soil degradation wherever we can. And I think that there's something quite positive actually in this, for it's at this local level where we live that we have the most power to affect change and to act effectively in service of the common good now and in the future. And in this context, it's the watershed basin that is the minimum unit at which water should be managed. And I think this fact in itself, the fact that basin-scale watershed management is critical to social, economic, and environmental resilience to changing hydroclimatic conditions, should inspire our actions. And what I said was that while the memory of recent flooding was still fresh, and before the next disaster, well, this was the time to move. And I concluded my presentation by saying it's too late for pessimism. We are not helpless, that this is not the time to throw up your hands in hopeless despair. This was a time for courageous and relentless citizenship and heroic leadership. This, as much as in any other time, is when we need perceptual leadership that only art can offer, and we need art to help us show the way to hope. Now, what's interesting about this is the artist to whom I spoke didn't buy that. Nope. They could not see, and express very articulately, they could not see how more forceful interpretation of the evidence should make one any more hopeful about a positive outcome to the climate issue. The artist from China, whose work is in this exhibition, was working on a massive sculpture that would interpret the most recent catastrophe to hit the front pages in his home country, which involved some 16,000 rotting pig carcasses disposed of in a river. And he maintained that given the regime presently in power in his country and the damage that was being done to natural systems and in particular to water, he simply could not countenance hope. Such threats had been highly visible in China for decades, and little had been done to react to worsening conditions. The artist from Tehran was carefully crafting some of the exquisite ceramic bowls that you saw in the exhibition and covering them with painted motifs that suggested they represented the different cultures around the world that might use them to drink water. And after witnessing the rapid decline of the quality of life circumstances in her home country, she indicated that she could point to no hope politically that suggested that things might turn out differently than they currently are in the Middle East. And if nations existed without at least a hint of positive interest in addressing the declining state of our planetary life support system, then for her, hope was out of the question. The artist from India, a Hindu, had a very different view. He declared that hope was not something he expected to have, in that practicing Hindus were trained to accept the world as it is and not to attempt to impose one's personal values upon that which operated at a higher level of order, divinity, and destiny. The artist from Quebec, again whose magnificent work is in this show, she had a great interest, of course, in water, and she indicated that she'd given up having hope for the future long ago. She was 42, she said, and had forgone children because she thought it irresponsible to bring people into the kind of the world that she could clearly see coming into existence. And as the conversation proceeded, none of the artists backed away from these positions, and all we could agree upon was that we should all hope to have hope in the future. And what we arrived at, what was in essence what psychologists sometimes call radical hope, a condition in which those who hold hope do not yet have an appropriate understanding of the end to which hope might be directed. And for me, the discourse was characterized later in this extraordinary painting by Stephen Hutchings, who believes that extreme weather events that are becoming so common mirror the turbulence and potential violence within the collective psyche of our times. And like the artists that I met at the Banff Center, Hutchings has no hope for the future at all. This was very dark for me, I should point out, and it might be for you, but these troubling discussions left me with no alternative but to give further thought to how one might frame hope within the context of the rapid changes that are taking place in the world, which threaten to make it a very different place than the one from which we emerged and evolved toward in our current circumstances. So, in a real sense, by rejecting my optimism, art in a way performed its function. It's forced me to work to articulate more defensible reasons for having hope and a new end toward which hope might be directed. And as you can imagine, this has not been simple. And as I've given up pretty much on my own generation, I decided that perhaps the best way to initiate this inquiry was to pull young postdoctoral and grad students and working professionals with an interest in water on what hope meant to them and why we need to have it in the future. And I did this by way of 2 workshops offered as part of a major water conference held at Queen's University in Kingston in May. And I asked volunteer participants to weigh in on 3 matters related to what we think about our prospects as a society in the future. And the first was, well, whether or not there was hope. The second was, if indeed there is hope, what should we be hopeful about, or to put it a different way, into what should we be investing hope? And finally, we asked them to explore how, if there is hope, we can inspire others toward possessing and acting on that hope. Now, this is an interesting debate because I acknowledge that from the first point, that some of them would, of course, say that if they didn't believe in hope, why should they stay? And why should they even have a discussion about it? And I warned, I said if they didn't have hope, we wanted to know why. And I warned that those without hope for the future might have to defend that view. And all of you in this room know the risks associated with having to defend how you think. The risk is that in putting forward and defending your opinions, you may be swayed by the views of others. So in attempting to convince others of the validity of your argument, they may convince you of theirs. And again, I think seriously exchanging ideas, which is part of art, is a risky proposition indeed, and that's what makes this dialogue so meaningful. So I was quite impressed with what I learned and what we all learned. I found it interesting that at the outset of the workshop, most of the participants nonchalantly declared themselves despairing of the future. Nope, not good. And it was almost as if it was fashionable, even in youthful circles, to accept that the world in the future is going to be less than the world today. And it appeared that this generation had been told so many times that they were going to live in diminished circumstances that they were almost blasé about it. But it was interesting, too, that you didn't have to press very hard to find out that this wasn't really so. This was more of a front. And while there were still some holdouts, when challenged, participants acknowledged much more reason for hope than they let on. And they saw the value of education, which we saw tonight, the potential for technology and innovation to make things better, and unanticipated shifts in perspective that could make the future brighter. It was also interesting that there was a significant difference of viewpoint regarding hope based on where you grew up and what hope had meant in those circumstances. And what we found is that if you grew up in Iran or Egypt, West Africa, or India, the parameters of hope were different than if you came from Canada or the United States. If the country you came from had a history of instability, the preconditions for hope were different. Hope for these people was situational. They hoped loved ones were safe, that people they cared about were not going to die in meaningless crossfire, that the countries from which they came would not become failed states. And they could not understand why Canadians declared themselves resigned for no good reason to hopelessness when they had all the tools, the education, the technology, the wealth, and enough water to construct any future they might imagine. And these arguments proved persuasive, and soon almost everybody conceded that they were or could be hopeful about the future. But along with this, there was also fear. Grave concern was expressed about human numbers and the impact of ever-growing populations on the integrity and function of the Earth's system. Deep frustration surrounded how denial and prevarication were standing in the way of having the public and adult conversation we so desperately need on how volatile nature has become, and ask the question of how bad things have to become before we act. And it was in this context that it was held that hopelessness was in fact a cop-out, a form of passive denial. And it was also held, interestingly enough, if you have a duty toward water, then perhaps you have a duty toward hope. And it was noted that in many instances, it was helplessness that begets hopelessness, and it was critical, therefore, to reject helpfulness. And everyone is not apathetic, they argue. We have to get past the apathy that does exist and restore gratitude for what we have. We have to fight against fatalistic acceptance. We need a new environmental conscience, which I thought interesting considering what was said in the opening remarks before this talk. We have to strand some current assets and strand some contemporary ethics while we're at it. We have to make it normal to want the world to be better and wilder. And it was held that humans are capable and willing to make changes, and we're all in this together. And this was a time for intelligent, courageous, and relentless citizenship and leadership at all levels of society. Young people, they concluded, need to become the leaders they want. What is required are new, energized forms of civic engagement. Networking is critical. Intergenerational dialogue is necessary. And it was quite interesting because when asked to create a symbol of hope for the future, the results almost always had something to do with water, and the most common symbol of hope for the future was a boat. Now, in all of these discussions, the general sense was the future is still largely going to be an extension of the world that we know today. And in that sense, what we saw is that there was a certain linearity to this idea of hope. But one question that had to be asked is what happens if our assumptions about the future are wrong? For most of my lifetime, future environmental projections, the dark ones in particular, could only be glimpsed peripherally, as though they could not endure the tension. They dashed off the stage of consciousness the moment the curtain of predictable everyday life was lifted and the light of contemporary reason which held them to be non-existent fell upon them. These are matters in the 70s, for example, like the water and climate issues that we face today. What's interesting, though, is now these nightmare possibilities don't stay on the stage under the full brightness of everyday awakening. They go beyond that. They stare back at us, howling like banshees. And I think it's fair to say, if you work in science, it's frightening out there. All you have to do is open a newspaper or turn on the television news to know that something very big and very unpleasant appears to be looming ahead, and whatever it is appears to have something to do with water and climate. So what we're saying here is the loss of hydrologic stability has created effects that have already begun to affect and cascade through every ecosystem on the planet and through every economy. And in a dramatically changed world, hope might have to lose its linearity also. So how shall we frame hope in a different world? We may have to reframe the world first and then frame hope around that new possibility. Now, I wish to report to you, and many of you in this room will know this, that there are very knowledgeable people around the world who are of the view that what we're seeing in terms of hydroclimatic change is just one manifestation of much broader effects human numbers and activities are having on the Earth system. It's being put forward in enlightened scientific and policy circles, not just abroad, but also here in Canada, that our impacts are of such a scale that we have, in essence, entered a new geological era in which human activities rival the processes of nature itself. And they are calling this new geological era the Anthropocene. And the foundation of the Anthropocene rests on new understanding of how the Earth system actually works. Four components in tandem appear to regulate the stability that makes conditions for life on this planet possible. These include the atmosphere, the air we breathe, the hydrosphere, the water we drink, the cryosphere, which provides the refrigerating influence of the Earth's snow, glaciers, and ice sheets, and finally the biosphere, the living elements of the planet. Through our emissions, we have changed the composition of the atmosphere. Our land use changes and water demands have altered the hydrosphere. Rising sea surface temperatures are shrinking the cryosphere, and our agriculture and growing global presence are reducing biodiversity. And as a consequence of these compound impacts, our climate's begun to change. Now, from a practical point of view, the concept of the Anthropocene is not as frightening or as logical as it might first appear. What the concept recognizes is that humanity has in itself become a major force in changing the nature of the Earth's surface. And it's very hard to deny that. At 40,000 parts per million, our exhaled breath contains 100 times the concentration of carbon dioxide than that of the atmosphere. So in a sense, we're a presence of warmth on the world. And we have become a force in our own right, certainly in terms of weathering and erosion. We have also altered global carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and water cycles. We're causing changes in the chemistry, salinity, and temperature of our oceans, and we're also altering the composition of our atmosphere. And in tandem, our effects are now significant enough to alter weather and climate patterns globally. So those are, in a sense, the hard facts. And I think the concept of the Anthropocene is interesting in that it calmly and dispassionately, and I'm not sure I can do that, recognizes that we have changed the terms and conditions of life on Earth. And within this concept, it's important, others observed, that there should be no blame attributed for the circumstances in which we find ourselves. We should recognize that we did not intend to do this. The Anthropocene concept simply suggests that we should recognize these impacts and manage them. And some have said, and you may not agree with this either, that it's a relief actually to enter the Anthropocene. The idea of the Anthropocene is that we should stop ignoring what we have done and are doing and start recognizing what we have become. We're now a force of nature, and as such need to act accordingly in the interests of our long-term survival. We have no choice now, for example, to work with a changing climate, not against it. We have to prepare for more powerful storms and more frequent flooding because that's likely what we're going to get. So what are the implications for us as we see them here in Canada? Well, most of my work this past few years deals with the effect of changing hydrologic conditions on the Canadian prairies. And the fact remains, though, that what's happening in the prairies is also happening very widely, including here in the Great Lakes region. Consider this. There has been a 50% increase in the duration of precipitation events on the Canadian prairies since 1940. There's been a 30% increase in total precipitation in some parts of the prairies since the 1990s. The increase in the intensity and duration of precipitation events has already resulted in a four-fold increase in stream flow during these events. And researchers have demonstrated that the four-fold increase in stream flow volume and runoff ratios after 1994 is likely due to nonlinear and threshold responses to a combination of changes in land use, recent dramatic increases in wetland drainage, and a changing climate. So what we see from this is what Manitoba faces is similar to what's making it difficult to restore Lake Erie. It faces the likelihood of a significant increase in the frequency, duration, and extent of flooding as a combination of regional land use changes, drainage effects, stream flow changes, and the intensification of the larger hydrologic cycle. Now, what's interesting about the prairies, however, is that mean temperatures on the prairies are expected to rise by as much as 5 to 8 degrees Celsius. So the basic laws of physics make it likely that floods in the region will become ever larger. The loss of hydrologic stationarity means that the established bell curve of climate risk is meaningless. In a more or less stable hydroclimatic regime, you're playing poker with a deck you know and can bet on risk accordingly. The loss of stationarity is playing poker with a deck in which new cards you've never seen before keep appearing more and more often, ultimately disrupting your hand to such an extent the game is no longer meaningful or can be played. And unfortunately, it appears that southern Manitoba may be the first heavily populated region in this country to be affected in this way. And I have to say, in visiting all of these flood-affected areas over Canada in the last few years, I can't help but feeling that if there's a place in the country that has clearly entered the Anthropocene, it may be the Central Plains. So the Anthropocene in the prairies is going to very likely be a turbulent era. And I find it really interesting because social media is ahead of us on this. And not surprisingly, given the extent of social media, we already have an iconic image of what the geological period we've just entered is going to be like on the prairies. And, you know, it's a bit of a frightening image, I suppose, but it's also one of optimism and hope. Let me show it to you here. On Saturday, July 5th of this year, a young Saskatchewan couple chose to have their wedding photographs taken on a rural road outside of Regina when a tornado formed in the distance behind them and later blew down and flooded their reception tent. I thought this was really interesting because the bride characterized the brave new world in which we are now in on Facebook, of course, and you're going to love what she said. She said, "We captured a once-in-a-lifetime moment and feel so lucky to have it as a memory of how, in such chaos, you always have each other." So there you have it, love and hope in the Anthropocene. So as a witness of these kinds of changes in Canada and abroad, I've often been asked if it's really possible to have hope for the future. And when I ask exactly what's meant by this question, the answer I most often receive relates to whether or not there's any hope for resolution of these problems before they accelerate beyond our capacity to manage them. Can we turn these problems around while they're still more or less linear and incremental before they become non-linear and everything we rely upon for stability in the world begins to change at once? And others ask, well, is there hope for their children? Is there hope for the yet unborn? They know the world's changing, sliding toward invisible thresholds from which there may be no way back in any time meaningful to us today. And there's also widespread recognition that our political systems are not designed and structured in a manner that would easily allow them to be capable of addressing issues of this magnitude. The scales are wrong. While political systems are designed to function over periods of 4 or 5 years within often competing jurisdictions, the problems we've created for ourselves are mismatched in that context, both spatially and temporally. Many doubt it's possible to rescue our political systems from the influence of vested economic and ideological interests and self-referential focus of party politics and anything close to the time that we need to prevent the collapse of important elements of the Earth's system. And many feel helpless to do anything as a result of that to prevent our society from slipping over the edge of the abyss. And I think that this helplessness, as the others indicated, really masks as a loss of hope. And I have to say that I don't feel hopeless. In my view, this is not the time to feel that way. And while we must always be on guard for false optimism and self-interested government and corporate happy talk, this is not the time in my mind to let hope fail us. The rate of change is compounding. We have to get moving. Welcome to the Anthropocene. And while hope is said to spring eternal, it appears that there's been problems with it all through all of human history. It's been a tenuous and problematic proposition to hope for the future. And in the earliest mythology, hope is most closely associated with Pandora, the first human woman created by the Greek gods. And as Hesiod explains, each of the gods on Olympus helped create her by giving her special gifts. And the myth really gets going, of course, as you all know, when Pandora opened a jar, later interpreted as a box, containing all the evils of humanity. And Hesiod doesn't record why she did this, only that she didn't do it maliciously. And nor does Hesiod report what particular evils are released beyond the usual litany of plagues and misfortunes. But what's interesting about the myth is that when Pandora replaced the lid, only hope remained inside. And a century later, Theognis of Megara interpreted the Pandora myth in a way that haunts even today. Hope, he reported, is the only good god remaining among mankind. The mighty god trust is gone, and the graces have abandoned the earth. Judicial oaths are no longer to be trusted, and men no longer recognize rules of conduct or restraint. Sounds like where I live in Alberta. No. And it appears that hope remains to promise each of us the good things that fled. There remains, however, lingering doubt about whether hope pertains only to the evils released to the jar, and whether the fact that hope remained in the jar means that human existence is utterly hopeless. And in these mythological arguments, which are probably quite extraordinary to enjoy with expert others, it's really interesting to note that false hope was considered to be very dangerous and ultimately a bane to humanity in that it robs us of the will to change and makes us prone to evil. So getting things right in the end now and giving hope a chance may be the equivalent of getting the science right. Science is important, but I have to say that it's not going to be enough. And though almost all of my scientist colleagues have declared me irrationally optimistic, the interpretation I favor is that the countless evils fled Pandora's jar, they certainly continue to plague humanity. The hope is that we might be able to master those evils and find that which is imprisoned positively. That is the hope that we have for the future. And if we're to survive the Anthropocene, we're going to have to find Pandora's lost jar and reopen it. And as the exhibition here so clearly demonstrates, we need art's help to do that. Belief comes down to trust. We need to trust our senses and our intuitions. Water is the ultimate expression of Earth's system function. If you need to be inspired, follow the water. And it's easy to do. Go to the kitchen, turn on your tap, let the water run, feel the cool moisture of wind and wetness of cloud and rain, feel the cold of snow and the hardness of glacier ice. Hear thunder, feel the river flow through your hands, feel the water within you yearn for the water without. Fill a glass, bring it to your lips, search your tongue for water's memory of faraway seas, taste distant mountains, feel the fissures in deep limestone tingle, hold the glass up to sunlight, see our star burn through the sparkling lens made of the most amazing of all liquids. Behold the glass, through the glass, the sky and the winds. Experience the aesthetic arrest that accompanies the realization that what we breathe is not just inert air, but the suspended residue of every geological event and ecological process that has ever taken place in or near water on the surface of the earth and its oceans since the beginning of the world. Breathe the moist breath of everyone and everything that has ever lived. Hold up your glass and drink and repeat until hope is finally and fully restored. Thank you.